Welcome to Analysis. I'm John Rees. The last Tory government had a plan to curb campus protests by students. The plan was to introduce legislation that would make it legally enforceable for students to listen to views they found offensive. When Labour won the last election, they stopped the legislation in its tracks, describing it as unworkable. But now Labour is planning to reintroduce a tweaked version of the Act. I made this report earlier. The Labour government has recommitted itself to enacting Tory legislation on freedom of speech in colleges. The last Conservative government had the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act ready to be implemented. But the incoming Labour Education Minister, Bridget Phillipson, hit the pause button on the controversial proposal when Labour won last July's general election. At that point, Phillipson argued that university authorities would be tied up in expensive legal cases if the law insisted that they police freedom of speech on campus. But now Phillipson has announced she will bring forward an amended version of the Tory Act. The Act is aimed at quelling student protest by making it legally enforceable for speakers with unpopular ideas to be allowed a platform in universities. Some critics fear that the Act will simply give additional force of law to practices where it is considered necessary that, for instance, pro-Israeli voices are protected, where pro-Palestinian voices find it harder to express themselves in the student world, in spite of the widespread support that the Palestinian cause has among students. At the time that the Tory Act was paused, a government source told the BBC that the legislation would have opened the way for Holocaust deniers to be allowed on campus and was an anti-Semite charter. This sounds as if the renewed legislation will have as steep a bias against those on the left, against whom charges of anti-Semitism have been weaponised since Jeremy Corbyn's tenure as Labour leader. Moreover, the Act will make the state the arbiter of who has the right of freedom of speech and who does not, and it will make student protest against unpopular views effectively illegal. So, what will this new Act mean? Will it end in the criminalisation of student protest and the further marginalisation of critical voices? Well, to discuss all this, I'm joined by Zaid Altikriti from the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, and we're also joined by the President of FOSIS, Shehab Ismail. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Shehab, this is a bit of an odd question, really, isn't it? Because most protests on campus aren't aimed at banning people from speaking. They're aimed at expressing views different to those that the speaker might have, opposed to those that the speaker might have, but not of particularly having them banned.
Yes, exactly. And actually, it is a staple. And we all know about this freedom of right, the right of freedom of speech. My apologies. We know that students, they have the right to voice their opinions. Now, yes, people might disagree with the opinions being presented, but there should never be any opportunity to limit speech as long as it is not inciting hate against other people.
Yeah, Zaid, I mean, there's a long history of student protests, of people saying, look, I don't agree with this speaker. I want to make it clear that we don't think they should have been invited, but not necessarily trying to stop them from actually speaking in the so-called cancel culture that we hear so much about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's, as you said, a very clear history of student protests, of dissent. And I think that university higher education at its core is about this exchange of ideas. It's about this ability to discuss your differences and to either reach a common ground or simply understand each other's perspectives. And so when speakers are invited who are potentially controversial, who espouse alternative opinions to what the student body might feel, having the ability as a student to express yourself is something that should be an inalienable right? That ability to put your opinion forward and not fear for your education, for your future, or anything like that, which is what legislation like this could potentially threaten.
And Shehab, there must be a worry here that if this were introduced even where there was a level playing field, where all actors in the political debate were treated equally, it probably wouldn't be a good thing then. But it's not being introduced where there's a level playing field, is it? It's being introduced in a situation where some voices find it much, much more difficult to book a room, to express themselves openly and without interference. So it's liable to make what's already an uneven playing field more uneven.
Yes, and I hear what you're saying, and there are concerns about this, especially with Muslims and minority groups being negatively and disproportionately affected by this. And it is always crucial that Muslims are free and able to present their opinions without being worried of discrimination or prosecution. And this is where FOSIS comes in to try and make sure that students are comfortable and confident and that they are not being prosecuted unfairly. Now, we do know there are cases, including Prevent, we do know cases where Islamic societies in particular have been prevented from platforming certain speakers, more so and disproportionately when compared to other societies. And I can discuss this further in this conversation, but there are several anecdotes from Islamic societies when this has been the case and they have been disproportionately and unfairly affected by this.
Zaid, are you worried that there would be a bleed over from this legislation to Prevent? You know, it's hard to see how somebody who was perhaps caught up in legislation, caught up in legal action around something like this, wouldn't then find themselves referred to the Prevent scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, as Shehab mentioned, the history of Prevent and the so-called war on terror, the increased surveillance on Muslim students, they go hand in hand, this legislation and that. The fact that Muslim students potentially speaking out will result in university I'm not sure what's happened to my camera there, apologies. Potentially universities will crack down on those voices. And of course, that would naturally lead to the kind of labels of extremism. And all that does is affect people's futures. All that does is kind of clamp down on opinions that should be able to be protected and freely expressed. But instead, we've created this environment of fear.
And Shehab, one of the concerns that Bridget Phillipson had when she initially put the stop to the introduction of this legislation was that this would end up in very costly and possibly very lengthy legal action, where people said either the university authorities weren't obeying the new act, or people challenged the decision that a university authority had taken, saying that it was misusing the act. It's hard to see how there isn't an expensive legal minefield here.
Yeah, and that is definitely a concern and a worry that many people have. But it is important to understand that freedom of speech should be protected. Now, these legislations or these rules should be clearly defined. They should be clearly explained to the students as to what they mean, how they are going to be applied by the universities and the student unions, so that the students are, able to comply with this new rule and without being afraid of prosecution or legal action. I think that's crucial. I think education is where it's most important.
And Zaid, what do you think about the situation where a piece of legislation is introduced to protect freedom of speech, but then presumably if students protest against somebody who's been, if you like, legally endorsed as having freedom of speech, they themselves will then be cast as enemies of freedom of speech, perhaps even people who have broken the law. So what looks like, what has as its title a defence of freedom of speech, may end up being exactly the reverse of that.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think it's the deep irony of the biggest proponents of freedom of speech who generally come from the right. This proposition that the fact that you will be able to say literally anything that you want generally only empowers those who espouse racist, hateful views. Things like Islamophobia become kind of entrenched in the opinions that are being put out there. And then the counter opinions to that are the ones shut down. We saw over the summer and then at the start of this academic year, the impact of encampments, the pro-Palestinian encampments that were happening up and down the country. and the way that various universities were dealing with these students by pushing them off campus, by suspending students. I'm a student at SOAS, and there were two of the presidents of the student union were suspended for being a part of the encampment. Now, all of this within the framing of freedom of speech is not going to help their situation. It will generally, and of course, you can read into the fact that the legislation was initially introduced by the Conservative Party. It will likely only empower those on the right who do espouse genuine hatred. Things like Islamophobia will just become far more widespread and protected in law.
Zaid, let me just ask you to tell us a bit more about that action at SOAS, because that ended up with quite draconian measures being taken. I mean, you've mentioned some of it, but it was really quite a kind of brutal dispersal of that encampment at the end by the university authorities, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm on campus right now. The encampment is around 100 meters away from me because they're legally not allowed to cross the boundaries of SOAS grounds. The fact that the green where the encampment was initially set up is currently fenced off. No students are allowed to enter there. To be honest, even the mention of encampments in classroom, you can kind of tell that there's a level of discomfort there when dealing with administration, with management, with teachers. All of this stuff has kind of established this mentality across the board that we don't discuss these views, those specific actions. And as you said, it's been extremely draconian the way that the university has dealt with it, especially at an institution like SOAS, which is kind of known for being a very activist uni, generally more progressive in that sense. But that's the way that they decided to go about it. And now legal action has even started against the uni from those affected at the encampment.
And Shehab, let's just go back to the sort of general impact of this, because it will likely have an impact beyond students. It's obviously aimed at student protest. It's only sort of directly applicable to universities. But if freedom of speech is curtailed and freedom to protest is curtailed in universities, the likelihood is that that will have a knock-on effect, at least culturally, at least ideologically, possibly practically, in the wider society, isn't it?
Yes, and usually the changes that are affected on university grounds do end up, going into wider society. And we've seen this so many cases before where student movements have led to wider community movements. And I think starting with universities and higher education, they understand that this is a ground where students are very passionate about their views and very passionate about what they want to voice and their opinions, and they understand that this needs to be guided in some way. But I do think the conversation should be more about how should it be guided, how can everyone be free to present their opinion without being worried about the backlash, while at the same time not being worried or being afraid of offending other people. I think the idea of having clear rules, clear understanding of what should be said, what can be said, what can be done. I think that's more important, to have this transparency in regulation, and that would definitely encourage people to be comfortable and safe. Now, in terms of it becoming a wider community, then anything that is good, if it becomes wider, alhamdulillah. But I think definitely things should be controlled. I think definitely things should be understood, and things should be more. We should be careful with how things are done.
And what do you think those parameters should be? I mean, normally it's said that freedom of speech stops where there's direct incitement to harm or violence. Is that your view?
So freedom of speech is, as we know, is a human right, and the issue with hate speech is it could be understood in so many different ways, and it could be very subjective, and that's why, in my opinion, we should have very clear, objective rules around freedom of speech, around what is defined as hate speech. And I think that is definitely something that's crucial. We need to define what is classed as hate speech, especially when many universities have adopted the IHRA definition, which prevents many students from speaking or defending Palestine or speaking against Zionist states. So I think these things should be very clearly defined, to protect those people.
Zaid, do you think that there's been a kind of bleed, if you like, over from saying that freedom of speech should end where there is actual harm or violence being promoted, to a situation where some people read it as you don't have the right to cause offence? And I think perhaps what the Tory legislation now, Labour legislation, is doing is creating an environment which confuses those two things and seeks to introduce state supervision of that whole area of speech.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the maybe the motivation behind that kind of dichotomy is that some ideologies might be seen as inherently violent or inherently problematic. So, as I mentioned before, with Prevent, the war on terror, the spotlight that was put on Muslim communities was that whatever speech was Islamic in nature would be an inherent call to violence. That was the way that it was seen, right? And I can mention many personal anecdotes of people who attended university and had literal surveillance inside their prayer rooms, had people from outside come in and kind of take over, because there was the assumption that if you are speaking in an Islamic sense, you are inherently calling for violence. What we're saying is that you can be offended, I can be offended. That's not an issue, because the beauty of this kind of framing of freedom of speech is that if either of us are offended, we can discuss it in a free manner where we can find some common ground, where that exchange of ideas, as I mentioned at the start, that exchange of ideas can take place so that we can understand each other and come to some kind of agreement. But the problem is that if some people are allowed to offend but others aren't, then you've got that censorship regardless, and some views will be prioritized over others. And so I would say that the explicit call to violence, of course, we say without any question, that's something that has to be shut down and something that has to be legislated against. But when we're just talking about offense and making assumptions of what is offensive and therefore could be violent, I think that that's a gray area where government, especially where legislation needs to be very careful of overstepping the boundaries, because all of a sudden certain communities start to feel the effect far more than others. And historically, that has been the Muslim community.
Shehab, of course, there's a lot of legislation on the books already. I mean, you certainly aren't legally allowed to go around inciting violence against people. Do you feel that there's a kind of piling on of one act of legislation over another because it's ideologically useful, rather than actually there is some kind of gap in the law which needs filling by yet another act of parliament?
I think that is an argument that could be made, and I think that's where we have to look at, the legal authorities, whoever's the people in charge. They should look at the laws. They should look at the objectives, and they should make sure there is, first of all, no contradictions. Make sure there are no loopholes that can be utilized by people who want to cause harm, and they should be nice and clear and easy to follow. The problem with some legislations is they become very convoluted and very difficult to follow and understand, and it could be understood and interpreted differently by different people. And that's, I think, where certain issues could arise. But as long as things can be as clear as possible, guidelines are available, and examples, for example, are available and documented, I think that would be easier for the universities and student unions to follow, and for the students to understand as well. But also, I wanted to echo what Zaid was saying about the censorship and disproportional censorship, and the idea of being worried about offending someone. That shouldn't be the case. I shouldn't be worried about saying my opinion just because it might offend you. But in fact, you should be able to have a a dialogue to discuss what is my opinion, your opinion. We might disagree. It's nature. It's natural to disagree on certain points. But at the end of the day, we should be able to express them as long as we express them in a respectful, polite, wise way, as Islam invites us to do, then we should be able to do so.
And Zaid, what do you think about that argument that there isn't actually a kind of gap in the law that needs filling here? It's rather that on certain subjects, politicians want to wage the culture war, and they do so by introducing a piece of legislation which gives them the opportunity to talk about this, whether or not that legislation is actually necessary.
Yeah, I think that well, look, I'm no legal scholar, so speaking about gaps in legislation and how those gaps need to be filled or anything like that, it's by no means my area of expertise. But what I can speak to is the context of the Islamic community and what Muslims have experienced. The fact of the matter is that whether the legislation has deemed it necessary or not, historically we have been targeted, historically we have been affected. And so whether new legislation will be introduced or legislation was introduced in the past, and whether it's explicitly mentioned Islam and Muslims, we have still been the ones to feel it. And so I think that this is more of it's less of a legislative issue and more of a question of who occupies the corridors of power. When we talk about the makeup of parliament and the ideologies that generally seem to rule, Muslims tend to be on the outside of that box, and orthodox traditional Islamic viewpoints don't tend to be respected in that space. So whether the legislation creates a gap or fills a gap or anything like that, we still tend to be affected. Regardless of what the wording says, it still does come back to us, and we do bear the brunt of whatever the wording of it may be.
Well, that was Zaid Altikriti from the Federation of Student Islamic Societies and the president of FOSIS, Shehab Ismail, concluding our discussion on the new legislation which the Labour government is seeking to bring forward based on a Tory piece of legislation that was previously paused, which will be examining how our liberties are conducted in the universities and what students can and can't say and can't protest about. We'll be watching that legislation very closely as it goes through the House of Commons and as it's implemented in the colleges. But for today, that's the end of analysis. Thank you for watching and good evening.